Welcome to this lecture on depth of field in relation to the depth of field and motion photography assignment. So depth of field is the distance between the closest objects in focus and then the farthest point of focus. Now, we kind of talked about this when we were talking about the exposure lectures, and we're talking about how aperture works. So if you have a shallow depth of field, but it's a wide open aperture, small number. This is confusing, but it will make more sense as we get a little deeper. That means there's a focal plane where the rest of the elements will be out of focus. That doesn't mean your image, so this is the only part that's within focus here. There's a window of it, and then there's a kind of a plane of focus where it's going to be the sharpest. So everything will be out of focus, whether or not it's before or after the camera. It's going to have that soft, blurry effect with one part being in focus. The narrow aperture, deep depth of field, large number, tiny hole, is going to have a deeper distance. So your focal plane is going to be a lot longer. And with the one kind of, your focus area is going to be longer, and then your one focal plane is going to be here. So when you have a shallow depth of field, I like to think of it anything that's between f1.4 and f4 will give you a shallow depth of field. So you can kind of see those windows are a bit open. That's going to be those wide depth of fields. A medium average depth of field is about f5.6, I would say even f8. So these are sort of average. And deeper depth of field, same thing between f8 and f22, I would say it's f16 and plus. So these, I personally would say 5.6 to maybe even 11 are going to give an average depth of field. And then I would say about f16 up will give you that deeper depth of field. Depth of field is really dependent on your lenses. So this 18 by 55 is a Canon lens. This is a usual pretty good stock lens. Now remember when you are doing the specifications of your camera sort of quiz/worksheet, and you had to figure out your aperture range. This is what you may have to refer back to those answers. But the f18 to 55 millimeter lens, which is pretty common on most DSLR cameras, the kit, and it changes. So if you're at f18, the widest you can be is 3.5 and the deepest you can be is f22. If you're at 55 millimeter, where you're kind of changing your zoom, 5.6 and then 36 is the deepest. So you can get really deep, but you can't get that shallow with it. So you would have to kind of change your zoom to 18 millimeters. And keep that in mind when you're working with your camera. So the most open you can get. Now remember, when your aperture is most open, the most light you can get in. And when it's narrower, so f22, f16, least amount of light's coming in, so you need to have that more light. Think about, we were talking about that exposure triangle, and you have your bucket full of light, and you have to divide it between your cups of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So this is where you're going to think about, alright, I know I'm going to want a shallow depth of field. You want to pick your aperture first when you're shooting with the emphasis for depth of field for this assignment. I say pick your aperture first and then go from there. Another common lens is the 50 millimeter from Canon. This specific lens, I actually have this lens, it's great. I think I spent less than $100 on it. But it can get pretty wide at 1.8 to f22. So I can't get as deep as, say, the 36. But I can get pretty deep. But I can get that gorgeous soft focus with this lens. It's beautiful. I like being able to play around with it. Before we get into lectures now, Some of the assignments are going to talk about, or the readings are talking about aperture priority, where you tell the camera, it's a semi-automatic mode where you tell the camera, this is the shutter speed I want, and then it makes the adjustments on, or this is the aperture I want, and this makes the adjustments in the shutter speed based on what it presumes to be a good exposure. This can be a good way to play around, but everything has to be shot in manual for this class, so you need to shoot in manual so you can practice to know how to make these change and assessments. Remember, we are smarter than a camera. We can't let computers take over what we know. So look at some shallow depth of field examples. So these are great for many different ways. And remember, all of the artists' names are right there. So if you see a photograph you really love, write their name down or pause the video, Google them. I'm sure they all have Instagram so you could follow. But shallow depth of field's great for portraits. So we have this focal plane of the children, it's soft, we had this great natural light. And that means, so the F, it's probably around 3.5, I'm guessing. And everything kind of fades into the softness back here with the shallow depth of field. It's a sunny day, so the ISO's probably pretty good. And then the shutter speed. So you think about your triangle when you're working. Another great, now this is sort of a long road, but we have this gorgeous composition. We have this first rooster kind of highlighting our attention, is contrasting between the background, and then our eyes are going back to the line, but we see this line here. So there's really kind of great cross composition. But we see what's in focus up here. This is kind of where the focal plane is. And everything softly goes back. It's very gorgeous. Portraits, gorgeous, beautiful for shallow depth of field. Think about how you can use that light and really emphasize your subject when you're using a shallow depth of field. It's a great way to say, this is my subject, this is what's most important. And the background's adding to it, but it's not distracting for the viewer. It's not adding details that are important. Another great photograph, so we have this here. The information here is really nice because it complements, but we have this sort of really shallow depth of field on these two figures. Another great one. So again, I like to guess around with my ISO first, then go to aperture. So keep that in mind. You don't want to get that noisy grain that is too high. So in a scene like this, you could probably have an ISO around 400 and not have that grain, depending on your camera. Some of your cameras are a little bit more grainy when I look at your images, so keep that in mind. Something that's really great about depth of field is how you can trick things. So this is sort of using like doll figurines. But the shallow depth of field gives it a really kind of sense of realness, and the scale is kind of hard to find. Kind of have that realness because you don't know if it's, you don't have that background in it, which is really fun. And that could be a fun way to play around. Again, you want to make it believable with that gorgeous lighting. That depth of field adds a reality to it that if it was a deep depth of field, it would be too painfully obvious that this was a miniature style work. Great way to show emphasis. Great way to work with nature. So we're seeing just a few examples of student work of shallow depth of field. This is a little bit more abstract. Working with nature and the outdoors. Really isolating our focus to what's important. Deep depth of field examples. So a lot of times this is going to be a little bit more landscape, where we need everything in that in view to be in focus. So again, making sure your camera's in focus. So it's again to play around with manual focus in your camera, but autofocus is your friend, especially if you need glasses like I do. This is really gorgeous because we have this here, which is almost too close to that focal plane, but everything back here that's in that deep depth of field, that it's so sharp against that contrast, and that this minimalist photograph that really kind of holds all of my attention. I wonder what's happening over that hill with these gorgeous lines and this mountain. It has a lot of great sense of wonder to it. Deep depth of field can be great for portraits too. So don't just, every portrait doesn't have to be a shallow depth of field. But we have our figure here. We have this table. So there's different things going on if you want to think about what's close, what's in that mid-range, foreground, midground, and background. And all that detail. Now the information is important, but using lighting, composition, contrast to really kind of highlight our subject. But everything else is really important. And it's great for us to lead our eyes around for that composition. This is beautiful, and it's a very simple shot indoors. So the white balance is not going to be easy for this one if you're still thinking about white balance. But the light on that beer glass is absolutely gorgeous, and you never think that a half-drinking beer glass would be so beautiful, but it is. Again, that deep depth of field, emphasizing those lines which are pulling your eyes all the way back and then back forward. So we're looking at every detail. Every detail is important. Again, this type of scene you would think typically would be a shallow depth of field, but it's a deep depth of field. Everything is in focus. There's not that shallow plane. And there's something great by this clutter. I'm enriched at everywhere I'm looking. Gregory Crutzen, you have to look up his work. It is absolutely gorgeous. And he uses really deep depth of field. He actually doesn't shoot digitally. He shoots film 8x10 negatives, so like a negative but the size of the sheet of the paper. He has a gorgeous documentary. It's on Canopy, K-A-N-O-P-Y, which is available through Phoenix College Libraries, which I definitely recommend learning about his process. But all that gorgeous detail, everything is absolutely important in the frame, and that's why we need this deep depth of field. Everything that's in front of us, he wants us to see. Same thing with this work. He shoots a lot with artificial lighting, but sort of creating that narrative and story. There's a lot of wonder, and every single little detail is so important, from these bottles to what's happening in the built room next door to what's in the restroom and the interaction between the people. And there's something about that being important because we're led back and forth through his composition. Emphasizing space with a deep depth of field is a great way to look around. Large rooms, large spaces. So take advantage. So using deep depth of field in a small space can work, but it's really going to be stronger in a room that's large. A shallow depth of field would not work well in this room. Here's some student work. Really emphasize wherever we're looking. So I want you to watch some of the other videos on depth of field and do some of the readings before you learn about motion. And I'll see you in a little bit.